The Galactic Preservation Society had perfected bureaucracy to an art form that would make even the most ambitious government clerk weep with envy. Tucked away in the sterile bowels of Station Epsilon 7, where the coffee was synthetic and the existential dread was very real, they managed the universe's most dangerous knowledge with the same enthusiasm most beings reserved for filing tax returns. Which is to say, none whatsoever. The morning briefing room hummed with the kind of fluorescent lighting that suggested whoever designed it had never actually experienced joy. 3 alien supervisors sat across from their newest assignment, a human female who had committed the cosmic crime of being both competent and available on short notice. The Velteran supervisor, whose tentacles twitched with what could charitably be called impatience, consulted a holographic display that flickered with bureaucratic malice. Archive Room 84-7B, announced the supervisor, as if the numbers themselves carried some terrible significance. Restricted terrestrial collection, standard cataloging and containment verification. The human archivist, fresh from the academy with delusions of intellectual adventure, leaned forward with the sort of eager expression that made seasoned civil servants develop ulcer. What exactly am I cataloging? The second supervisor, a crystalline being whose internal light pulsed in what the universal translators helpfully interpreted as deep sighs, exchanged what passed for meaningful glances with its colleagues. Primitive literature, fiction, mostly, some philosophy, the usual developmental detritus from emerging civilizations. How primitive are we talking? She asked, displaying the kind of professional curiosity that suggested she hadn't yet learned that some questions were better left unasked in government building. The third supervisor, whose bioluminescent patches flickered in patterns that definitely weren't Morse code but somehow conveyed the same level of doom, pulled up additional files. Pre-contact Terran material, approximately 12,000 individual texts, ranging from what your species quaintly calls literature, to various fictional narratives. 12,000 books. The human's eyes lit up with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for discovering chocolate or functional government program. That's incredible. I had no idea Earth had produced so much that warranted preservation. The supervisor's silence stretched longer than a congressional hearing, thick with implications that sailed entirely over their newest employee's head. Finally, the Velteran spoke with the careful tone of someone explaining fire safety to a pyromaniac. The materials require special handling. Archive Room 8047B maintains Class 7 containment protocol. You'll find the specific procedures in your briefing packet, along with emergency contacts and a comprehensive insurance waiver. Insurance waiver standard procedure. The crystalline supervisor interjected quickly, its internal luminescence dimming to what could only be described as diplomatically evasive. Nothing to concern yourself with. Simple liability protection. The human flipped through the briefing packet with growing bewilderment. Emergency evacuation procedures took up nearly half the documentation, followed by detailed instructions on containment field maintenance, psychological evaluation scheduling, and something ominously titled Cognitive Contamination Recognition Guideline. Bureaucratic terminology, the bioluminescent supervisor assured her, though its patches now pulsed in rapid patterns that suggested either excitement or panic. You humans have such imaginative language for standard archival process. What they didn't mention, what the briefing packet carefully avoided explaining in its 17 pages of technical jargon and liability waivers, was that Archive Room 8047B wasn't just a storage facility. It was a quarantine zone, the kind of place where dangerous things were kept not because they were physically harmful, but because they possessed something far more insidious. The ability to fundamentally alter how intelligent beings viewed their existence. The human gathered her materials with the confident stride of someone about to discover why the universe had trust issues with her species. The supervisors watched her leave with the resigned expressions of beings who had just handed a loaded weapon to an enthusiastic child and hoped for the best. How long do you think before she realizes? The Velteran asked once the human had disappeared down the corridor. Given human cognitive patterns, 3 days, maximum. The crystalline being replied, its light dimming further. Assuming she actually reads the warning label. She's human, the bioluminescent supervisor pointed out with what might have been dark humor. When have they ever read the warning labels? The three exchanged what passed for meaningful looks among species who had evolved entirely different concepts of facial expression. Somewhere in the depths of Station Epsilon 7, Archive Room 8047B waited with the patient malevolence of a cosmic joke about to deliver its punchline. The human walked through corridors lined with warnings she didn't understand, toward a room full of books that had already rewritten the galaxy's understanding of dangerous material. She hummed as she walked, a distinctly human trait that the aliens found both inexplicable and vaguely threatening. After all, only humans found music in the mundane march toward their own destruction. Archive Room 8047B existed in the kind of underground chamber that architects design when they want to ensure visitors understand they're somewhere very important and slightly ominous. The ceiling vanished into shadows that suggested either poor lighting budgets or deliberate psychological manipulation. Towering shelves stretched upward like metallic trees in a forest designed by someone with severe authority issues and a fondness for intimidating storage solutions. The human stood in the doorway, taking in the sheer scale of literary imprisonment with the sort of awe typically reserved for natural wonders or particularly impressive tax codes. Thousands of sealed containers lined the shelves, each wrapped in containment fields that hummed with energy signatures she'd only seen used for hazardous materials transport. "Bit excessive for books," she muttered, consulting her access tablet. The device chirped helpfully and projected a holographic map that looked like a cross between a library catalog and a minefield diagram. She approached the first stack of containers, each labeled with codes that suggested whoever designed the filing system had never actually intended for anyone to find anything quickly. The containment field around the nearest stack shimmered like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, except summer asphalt generally didn't require Class 7 safety protocols. The field dissolved at her biometric scan, revealing books that looked disappointingly normal. Leather bindings, paper pages, words arranged in the traditional configuration that had served human literacy for millennia. She picked up the first volume and nearly dropped it when the title registered, "The Complete Works of William Blake, Poet," she said to the empty chamber, which absorbed her voice with the acoustic properties of a tomb. "They're containing poetry." The next container yielded philosophy. Kant, Nietzsche, Sartre, a collection of human thinkers who had spent considerable effort proving that existence was either meaningless, incomprehensible, or both. The container after that held fiction. Tolkien, Asimov, Le Guin, authors whose imaginations had spawned entire genres and inspired countless readers to believe impossible things before breakfast. She pulled up the detailed inventory on her tablet, scrolling through titles that read like a survey course in human creative achievement. Everything from ancient epics to modern science fiction, from revolutionary manifestos to children's fairy tales. The kind of diverse collection that would make any librarian weep with professional jealousy. What made absolutely no sense was why any of it required containment protocols typically reserved for weaponized pathogens. Incident Report Archive. She read from her tablet's menu, selecting the option with the sort of fatalistic curiosity that had gotten her species into trouble since they'd first discovered fire. The holographic display materialized with bureaucratic efficiency, presenting a timeline that stretched back nearly 2 centuries. The first entry made her pause. Velteron First Contact Cultural Exchange Program, terminated. She opened the file and found herself staring at before and after images that looked like a cautionary tale about the dangers of interior decorating. The first image showed a typical Velteron settlement, geometric efficiency, clean lines, structures that prioritized function with the aesthetic sensibility of a filing cabinet. The second image showed the same settlement, 6 months later, transformed into something that looked like a fever dream collaboration between Gaudi and Dr. Seuss. Exposure to Terran narrative fiction resulted in unprecedented architectural reformation, the report noted with the dry tone of someone documenting the end of civilization. Velteron subjects began incorporating whimsical elements and emotional resonance into all civic planning. Productivity decreased by 73%. Request immediate containment of all Terran literary materials. The next report detailed the Crystalline Collective's unfortunate encounter with human philosophy. What had been a perfectly functional hive mind, dedicated to efficient resource distribution, had, after reading Thoreau, decided to embrace individualism and moved to separate planets to find themselves. The collective had never recovered. The bioluminescent confederacy's incident report was even more disturbing. Their species had evolved perfect communication through light patterns, until they discovered human poetry and decided their language needed metaphor and artistic ambiguity. The resulting communication breakdowns had nearly caused a civil war over whether their traditional greeting translated to "hello" or "your bioluminescence reminds me of dying stars," which is either deeply romantic or catastrophically depressing. Report after report detailed the same pattern: advanced alien civilizations encountering human literature and emerging fundamentally changed, not damaged, exactly, but transformed in ways that their own species found deeply unsettling. The geometric purists had developed artistic expression after reading human mythology. The logic supremacists had discovered emotional truth through human drama, and subsequently spent 3 decades arguing about whether feelings were mathematically valid. The human archivist sank into the nearest chair, which she noted with growing unease, was bolted to the floor and positioned at a safe distance from the book stacks. The incident reports continued for pages, each one documenting how human creativity acted, like a cognitive virus, spreading through alien cultures and leaving them irrevocably altered. She looked up at the towering shelves with dawning comprehension. This wasn't a library, it was a quarantine facility. The containment fields weren't protecting the books from environmental damage. They were protecting the rest of the galaxy from ideas that apparently rewrote how entire species understood reality. Her tablet chimed with an incoming message from the Velteron supervisor. Progress report required by end of shift. Trust everything is proceeding normally. The human stared at the message, then at the sealed stacks surrounding her, then at the emergency evacuation procedures posted on every wall. Normal, she reflected, was apparently a relative concept when dealing with literature that could accidentally topple governments and transform civilization. The books sat in their containers, patient and dangerous, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to let human imagination loose on an unsuspecting universe. The deeper she dug into the incident reports, the more the human archivist began to appreciate the cosmic joke her species had accidentally played on the universe. What the Galactic Preservation Society had euphemistically termed cognitive contamination was really just humans being aggressively, relentlessly human in the face of a galaxy that had apparently never learned to dream properly. The historical summary file painted a picture that would have been hilarious if it weren't so monumentally terrifying to everyone involved. Pre-contact, the galaxy had been a remarkably orderly place. Species evolved, achieved spaceflight, joined the galactic community, and proceeded to manage their civilizations with the sort of efficient predictability that made actuarial tables look spontaneous. The hierarchical determinists determined things hierarchically. The resource optimizers optimized resources. Everyone had their cosmic niche and stayed in it with the dedication of particularly well-organized ants. Then humanity had shown up with their literature, and suddenly everyone was having existential crises. The pragmatic collective's incident report read like a philosophical horror story. Their species had spent millennia perfecting logical decision-making processes that eliminated emotional variables from governance. Then someone had left a copy of Romeo and Juliet in their embassy's waiting room. Within a year, their Supreme Logic Council was debating whether love constituted valid grounds for overriding resource allocation protocol. The collective had nearly dissolved over arguments about whether Shakespeare's balcony scene represented inefficient architectural design or profound artistic expression. Cultural infection vector identified as storytelling, read one particularly damning analysis. Terran narratives demonstrate dangerous tendency to prioritize emotional resonance over logical efficiency. Recommendation: complete quarantine of all Terran creative materials. But the most unsettling revelation came from the Unified Field Theory Department's classified research. The alien scientists had tried to understand why human literature produced such dramatic effects on other species. Their conclusion, buried in technical jargon that couldn't quite hide the underlying panic, was that human creativity operated on fundamentally different principles than anything else they'd encountered. Most species, it turned out, evolved imagination as a survival tool, a way to predict predator behavior or plan resource gathering. Humans had apparently evolved imagination as an end unto itself, creating elaborate fictional universes for no practical purpose other than the sheer joy of creation. This made human literature function like a cognitive virus, spreading patterns of thought that other species had never developed natural immunity against. The report's final assessment was delivered with the clinical detachment of scientists describing a plague outbreak. Terran creative works appeared to trigger dormant neural pathways in alien psychology, activating previously suppressed emotional and creative responses. Exposure results in fundamental alterations to decision-making processes, social structures, and individual identity concepts. No known cure exists for affected population. The human archivist found herself laughing, the kind of slightly unhinged laughter that emerges when the universe reveals its punchline. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology or military might. It was their tendency to write stories about made-up people having feelings about imaginary problems, and somehow make it all feel important. Her tablet chimed with an urgent alert. Containment field fluctuation detected. Sector 7G. Immediate attention required. She hurried to the indicated section, where several containment fields were flickering like dying light bulbs. Through the wavering energy barriers, she could see books shifting slightly on their shelves, not from any physical disturbance, but from something far more troubling. The monitoring systems showed elevated readings across multiple spectrums, as if the books themselves were somehow straining against their confinement. The emergency protocols were quite clear about containment failures. Step 1. Evacuate the area. Step 2. Contact hazmat specialist. Step 3. File incident reports in triplicate. What the protocols didn't explain was how to handle books that seemed to be staging a literary jailbreak through sheer force of narrative momentum. She approached the failing containment field with the kind of professional curiosity that had probably gotten her ancestors in trouble with various authorities throughout history. The books inside looked innocuous enough. A collection of human science fiction that included everything from Asimov's robot stories to contemporary works about artificial intelligence and space exploration. Then she noticed the readings on her scan. The electromagnetic signatures weren't random fluctuations. They were patterned, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. As if the stories inside were somehow resonating with each other, building towards some kind of narrative critical mass. The philosophical implications hit her like a cosmic freight train loaded with irony. The books weren't just passively contained, they were actively straining against the barriers, driven by the same creative force that had made her species write them in the first place. Human imagination, it seemed, didn't recognize concepts like containment or proper galactic order as valid limitations on storytelling. She pulled up the facility's master control system and stared at the options before her. The containment reinforcement protocol would strengthen the barriers, ensuring the books remained safely sealed away from a galaxy that couldn't handle human creativity. The alternative, well, there wasn't supposed to be an alternative. The protocols assumed that any rational being would obviously choose containment over chaos. But as she looked around at the thousands of sealed stories, each one representing some human's attempt to make sense of existence through imagination, she began to understand why her species terrified the galaxy so much. Every book in this room was an act of rebellion against the idea that reality was sufficient, that existence didn't need to be examined, improved, or reimagined. Other species had created efficient civilization. Humans had created hope, wonder, and the dangerous notion that things could always be better if you just imagined them differently first. The containment field flickered again, and for a moment she could swear she heard something that sounded almost like whispered conversations. Thousands of human voices telling stories to an empty room waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The control panel presented its binary ultimatum with the sort of bureaucratic simplicity that made cosmic decisions feel like selecting lunch options. 2 buttons: reinforce containment and emergency release protocol. The first would strengthen the barriers holding 12,000 pieces of human imagination prisoner. The second would unleash them on a galaxy that had spent 2 centuries learning to fear the sound of humans having ideas. The human archivist stood before the controls while containment fields continued their electronic death rattle throughout the facility. Emergency lighting bathed everything in the kind of red glow that suggested important decisions were being made poorly and under pressure. Her scanner showed cascade failures spreading through multiple sectors. Whatever was happening to the books, it was accelerating. She thought about the incident reports, Those dry bureaucratic accounts of civilizations transformed by exposure to human creativity. The Veltarins discovering whimsy. The crystalline collective learning individualism. The bioluminescent confederacy developing poetic ambiguity. Each report had been filed as a disaster, but reading between the lines revealed something different. Species discovering parts of themselves they never knew existed. The irony was delicious in its cosmic scope. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had achieved perfect order by eliminating the very qualities that made existence interesting. They had optimized away wonder, systematized away surprise, and regulated away the dangerous possibility that things could be different. Then humans had arrived with their ridiculous stories about impossible things. And suddenly everyone was remembering what it felt like to dream. Her tablet chimed with incoming messages. The supervisors, no doubt wondering why their routine cataloging assignment was generating emergency alerts across half the facility. Soon they would send security teams and hazmat specialists and committees of very serious beings who would restore proper containment through the application of superior technology and bureaucratic procedure. The books pulsed again, their electromagnetic signatures synchronizing into something that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Thousands of human stories breathing together in their sealed containers, waiting for someone to decide their fate. She could feel them somehow, all those voices of writers, who had dared to imagine better worlds, who had looked at reality and decided it needed editing. The emergency release would be so easy. One button press and human imagination would spread through the galaxy like wildfire, transforming every civilization it touched. The orderly universe would become chaotic, inefficient, unpredictable. Species would waste time on art instead of optimization. Governments would consider emotional appeals alongside logical arguments. Entire civilizations might even develop senses of humor. It would be magnificent. It would be disaster. It would be so very, very human. But as she raised her hand toward the release button, something made her pause. Not fear. Humans had never been particularly good at letting fear stop them from doing stupid things. What stopped her was something far more dangerous: understanding. The galaxy wasn't wrong to fear human creativity. The incident reports had been filed as disasters, because from the aliens' perspective they were disasters. The Veltarins hadn't asked to discover whimsy. The crystalline collective hadn't requested individual. The pragmatic collective hadn't wanted their perfect logic contaminated by something as irrational as love. Humans had always assumed their creativity was a gift to be shared. But gifts, she realized, were only gifts when they were wanted. Otherwise they were just very polite invasions. She thought about her own species, scattered across human space, probably completely unaware that their literature was considered a galactic hazard. They wrote their stories and poems, and philosophical treatises because they couldn't help themselves. Because imagination was as essential to human existence as breathing. They didn't create art to transform alien civilizations. They created it because the alternative was not being human. The containment fields flickered again, and she made her choice. Her hand moved to the reinforce containment button, and pressed it without ceremony. Immediately new barriers descended from the ceiling like geometric waterfalls of pure energy. The wavering containment fields solidified into unbreachable walls of force. The pulsing electromagnetic signatures of the books faded to whispers, then to silence. The facility's emergency lighting returned to normal fluorescent efficiency. Her scanner showed green readings across all sectors. Archive room 847B was once again properly contained. Its dangerous cargo safely sealed away from a galaxy that wasn't ready for human dream. She sat down in her regulation chair, still bolted to the floor at a safe distance from the stacks, and filed her incident report with the sort of thorough professionalism that would make her supervisors very happy and very relieved. What she didn't include in the report was her final realization. The choice to contain human literature wasn't just protecting other species from human creativity. It was protecting human creativity from being turned into a weapon. The moment their stories became tools for transformation, they would stop being stories and become propaganda. The moment their imagination became a galactic export, it would cease being imagination and become policy. By keeping the books sealed, she was preserving something more valuable than the stories themselves. She was preserving humanity's right to create for no reason other than the joy of creation. The galaxy could keep its efficient civilizations and logical governments and perfectly optimized resource allocations. Humans would keep their messy, irrational, beautiful tendency to imagine impossible things and then write them down for the simple pleasure of sharing dreams with strangers. She settled into her chair and opened the first cataloging file, ready to spend her career as a guardian of the most dangerous library in the galaxy. Outside the facility, the universe continued its orderly business, blissfully unaware that 12,000 human stories sat sealed in perpetual containment, dreaming of better worlds they would never be allowed to create. The final irony wasn't lost on her. In choosing to protect the galaxy from human imagination, she had made a choice that was itself profoundly imaginative. She had imagined a universe where different species could coexist without forcing their gifts on each other, where creativity could remain pure by remaining contained, where the most human thing to do was to resist the urge to make everyone else more human. Somewhere in the sealed stacks, the book settled into patient silence, content to wait for a galaxy that might someday be ready for their particular brand of beautiful madness. Until then, they would dream their sealed dreams, and she would guard them with the fierce protectiveness that humans reserved for the things they loved most: their stories, their hopes, and their unshakable belief that reality could always use a good editor.